The thunder of oars drowned out the cries of seagulls. In the cold waters of the Thames, ships approached London. Not dozens, not hundreds, but 350 long dragons, their carved prows looking directly at the city. Smoke from tar and torches spread across the water. Each stroke of an oar was a sentence, and each splash a step towards the most audacious attack of the century. How did a city, considered impregnable, find itself on its knees before people who came from the north? And why, 1,000 years later, is this strike still considered a symbol of fear of the Vikings? The answer lies in one fatal mistake of the Anglo-Saxons, which modern man also often repeats. Fact: in the year 1011, the Norwegian Jarl Thorgil, known to chronicles as Thorkel the Tall, led an army gathered from more than 13,000 warriors to the walls of London. This was written by the chronicler of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the main source for events of the early 11th century. Huge wooden ships with dragon heads were called drakars. These vessels were a marvel of engineering of their time, light, flexible, and could move both by sea and by rivers. Their bottom was almost flat. Precisely this allowed the Vikings to land directly on the sand, as if the sea itself was pushing them towards their prey. The sea seemed to part before the iron wave. At dawn, the air was imbued with the smell of tar, blood, and fear. The inhabitants of London saw for the first time not just a fleet, but a moving wall of shields. The reflection of the sky and the water trembled from thousands of spears. The city, considering itself protected by walls and the river, suddenly realized the river is not an obstacle, but a road, and the enemy is coming directly along it. London at that time was not the capital of an empire, but a trading center, surrounded by a stone wall since Roman times. Its gates, Ludgate and Newgate, were considered invulnerable, and the bridge across the Thames was the main symbol of Anglo-Saxon power. But against people accustomed to living on water, these walls turned out to be simply a stone trap. Vikings called such sieges strandog, sudden raids on coastal cities. This word literally meant a blow to the shore. Thus acted not armies, but predators, swiftly, decisively, with precise calculation for fear. Precisely in this way began the assault that forever changed the history of England. The flame of torches reflected in the shields as if the sun itself had descended to earth. People in their homes heard the beats of drums like heartbeats before an execution. And while they prepared the gates for defense, the Vikings were already doing what no one expected. They began to break the river itself. The Thames, the lifeblood of London, its pride and defense. Its current was considered a natural barrier, and the bridge a symbol of stability. But the Vikings looked at the water differently. For them, the river was not an obstacle, but a path. Their idea was audacious, almost insane: to destroy London Bridge, to allow drakars directly to the city walls. Thus began the preparation for one of the most sophisticated sieges of the early Middle Ages. Historians write that before attacking, Thorkel the Tall gathered a council of chieftains. He knew the assault on London was not just a raid. It was a blow to the heart of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, to the prestige of King Ethelred the Unready himself. Thorkel's army consisted of Norwegians, Danes, and mercenaries from Scandinavia, hardened men, for whom the sea was home, and death merely another crossing. These fighters used a special system of organization called Lid, a military alliance based on an oath of loyalty to the Jarl. Each participant of the Lid was obliged to provide a ship, men, and weapons, and in return received a share of the spoils. This was not an army in the usual sense, but a brotherhood of wolves, where honor and gold were the balanced scales of fate. Thorgil understood. A direct assault on London's walls was madness. Therefore he chose a strategy worthy of sailors. The Vikings attached thick ropes to their drakars, securing them to the piles of London Bridge, and began to row backward, against the current. The water boiled, the ships groaned, but the pressure from many oars grew with each minute. The stone supports trembled as if under the assault of a living beast. When the bridge finally collapsed, the defenders' cries merged with the roar of the water and the cracking of wood. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes this moment in sparse words, but archaeologists confirm the lower layers of the bridge were indeed damaged and partially destroyed precisely at this time. For the city's inhabitants, this became a sign of the end. Their pride collapsed along with the bridge. The Vikings did not immediately proceed to the assault. They knew that fear was stronger than the sword. For several days they camped on both banks. Drums thundered, horns sounded, and all of London lived in anticipation of the inevitable strike. People said that at night lights flared over the river, fiery arrows flying in an arc like meteors. At this time, Thorkel's warriors prepared new weapons, not swords, but the jackscrews of the Middle Ages, wooden battering rams assembled from parts of the destroyed bridge. They called them Brynja Broter, which means armor breaker. These were long beams with which they struck the gates, sheltered by shields from arrows. Each ram required no fewer than 20 men, and each of them knew the first blow would decide the city's fate. It is known from chroniclers' diaries that the defense of London was led not only by soldiers, but also by simple craftsmen. They melted tar in cauldrons, prepared stones for throwing, and fortified the walls. London at that moment was not just a city. It became a symbol of resistance. And yet, people understood. The enemy at the gates was not accidental. He came not for plunder. He came for power. At dawn, when fog hung over the river, the Vikings moved again. Drakkar after Drakkar glided across the water like black arrows. The sounds of horns cut through the fog, and the city awoke with a scream. Thorkel, standing on the prow of his ship, raised his sword, and the fleet came alive like one enormous creature. This scene would later become a legend. It was then, according to some researchers, that the song "London Bridge is Falling Down" was born. Not a children's rhyme, but an echo of a real catastrophe that outlived its heroes for centuries. But the song had not yet been born. While London burned, and while the river, recently a road of life, was turning into a river of death, warriors who had passed through icy storms and battles at sea for the first time saw stone walls tremble before them, and behind this trembling, not fear, but the beginning of a new era, when the sea ceased to be a boundary between worlds and became a weapon in the hands of those who knew how to control it. In the next moment, the most terrible thing would begin. Not a battle, but a clash of wills. A clash between a people believing in fate and a people believing in order. And this clash would decide who would rule England in the coming years. The sky was covered with gray smoke, as if nature itself had turned away from the city. The sound of water was replaced by the roar of horns. It was a signal. 350 Drakkars moved forward, like living monsters with burning dragon eyes. On their prows gleamed the heads of beasts carved from wood, symbols of fury and luck. From this moment, London ceased to be just a city. It became an arena where it was decided who owned England. Fact: after the destruction of the bridge, the Vikings were able to approach the walls closely. According to chronicles, the defense was led by King Ethelred himself, and with him, a Dane by origin, but loyal to the Anglo-Saxons, Jarl Ulf. Their forces numbered about 4,000 men, 3 times fewer than Thorkel's forces. Due to narrow streets and dense construction, it was impossible to defend the city as a unified whole. Therefore, the Anglo-Saxons used a burh, a system of fortifications created around key gates and towers. Burh, this word meant fortified enclosure, essentially a prototype of a modern checkpoint. But against the Vikings, this system was powerless. They acted quickly, changing the direction of attack every few hours. First, the blow fell upon the northern wall. Warriors pressed together huge shields, forming a shield wall, one of Scandinavia's most famous battle formations. It was a mobile fortress, shield to shield, foot to foot, spears protruding between the planks like the teeth of a beast. People behind this wall did not see the enemy. They only heard the thud of arrows against wood, the smell of blood and burning tar. When the gates fell, the Vikings stormed into the city. They did not advance in disorder. On the contrary, they moved along a precisely calculated route. Thorkel divided the warriors into 3 parts. Some assaulted, others set fires, and the third blocked exits so that no one could escape. This was not just an attack. It was an anatomy of destruction, honed over years of raids. One chronicler wrote that the water in the Thames turned red, and smoke stood like a column, like a banner over defeat. Archaeologists confirm traces of a powerful fire from that period have been found in the layers of ancient London, traces of soot, ash, and melted lead, which had dripped from the tower walls. All this proves the battle was not a myth, but a real catastrophe. The Vikings used weapons designed for terror, spears with hooks to tear shields from hands, axes with long handles capable of piercing helmets. One such weapon was called a bronyok, a heavy two-handed axe almost a man's height in length. A blow from a bronyok could cleave a warrior in half, and eyewitness accounts conveyed the terror with which the Anglo-Saxons looked upon these enormous blades. Panic broke out among the defenders. Burning buildings collapsed. Streets turned into a labyrinth of smoke. The defenders retreated toward St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the few stone buildings. Women, old people, and children gathered there. Cries mingled with the chanting of prayers, but even the temple walls could not hide them from reality. The enemy was everywhere. When Thorkel entered the city, he did not give an order for total extermination. This seems strange, but it was precisely here that his tactics differed from typical barbaric raids. He came not to destroy, but to subjugate. His men planted their banners on the towers, collected tribute, and established control. The Vikings acted as occupiers, not as marauders. Some historians believe that Thorkel was not just a warrior, but a politician. He understood that power over London opened the path to the throne of all England. Therefore, he offered the city a choice, either destruction or Danegeld, a ransom in silver which was paid for peace. This word meant Dane money, and it would become the nightmare of all English kings of the next century. When the first chests of silver were brought to the shore, the warriors fell silent. The silence over the city was more terrifying than any scream. It meant only one thing: London had fallen. Not in battle, not in glory, but under the weight of gold and fire. But this peace turned out to be an illusion, because along with the silver, the seed of a new war entered the city. A war not for walls, but for souls. A war that would split England from within, and its first blow would sound very soon. The ashes of London had not yet cooled when a new game began on the banks of the Thames, a game of power. Thorkel the Tall was in no hurry to leave. He turned the city into his headquarters, and its inhabitants into a source of wealth. But most importantly, he did what no Scandinavian leader before him had done. He made a treaty with the King of England himself. Aethelred the Unready, exhausted by wars and betrayals, agreed to pay Danegeld, a colossal sum of 48,000 pounds of silver. This was more than the annual income of the entire kingdom. Fact: chroniclers note that the payment was ordered to be collected from all free people. Even priests and monasteries paid a share. This tax became a symbol of England's humiliation. Contemporaries wrote, "Silver flowed into the sea like a river, and with it, our honor." Thorkel set up his camp on the south bank of the Thames, where Southwark would later emerge. There, archaeologists indeed found remnants of Scandinavian settlements, hearths, arrowheads, and fragments of Norwegian fibulae. All this confirms that the Vikings settled here for a long time. They did not just plunder, they built. Within their camp, an iron order reigned. Each warrior had his place. Weapons were checked daily, and drakkars were repaired as if they were living beings. The main element of Viking life was called a longfair, a miniature battle house where trophies were stored and prayers were offered before a campaign. These houses smelled of tar, dried fish, and iron. A Viking not ready for battle at any moment was considered dead even before the fighting began. Meanwhile, London, devastated but not broken, began to revive. Merchants reappeared on the streets. Blacksmiths forged swords, and in taverns, rumors were whispered. Supposedly, Thorkel was not just a commander, but a man destined to overthrow the king. This fear grew until it turned into a prophecy, and soon it began to come true. In the spring of 1012, a new fleet approached the shores of England, this time Danish. It was commanded by the young but ambitious Prince Canute, son of King Sweyn Forkbeard. He arrived to assert his family's rule over the entire country. When Canute met Thorkel, the world held its breath. Two giants of the north, two swords in the same waters. Many expected war between them, but instead something incredible happened. They united. Historians call this alliance the turning point of Scandinavian dominion. Thorkel recognized Canute as his suzerain, and Canute left him in command of the army. Thus, from a mere raider, Thorkel became the de facto ruler of London on behalf of the new Danish king. Athelred tried to raise an army, but the fear of the Vikings was stronger. People saw in them not just enemies, they saw destiny. Chronicles describe how entire villages surrendered without a fight, bringing bread and beer to meet Canute's warriors. Better a Dane than death, they wrote then. But among the Anglo-Saxons there were those who chose not to bow. One of them was Jarl Edmund Ironside, Athelred's son. He gathered a detachment from the remnants of garrisons and moved towards London. Edmund was younger, faster, more determined than his father. He was called the Living Sword of England. When he arrived at the city walls, the Vikings had already fortified themselves inside. The siege began in reverse. Now the English surrounded their former masters. London once again became an arena, but now everything was different. Not smoke over the city, but banners over the towers. Thorgil, an experienced warrior, did not wait for an assault. He sent parliamentarians to Edmund, proposing negotiations. Chronicles assert that he already understood. The time of raiders was passing, and the era of rulers was beginning. Thorkel proposed a deal. London would remain under Canute's rule, but in exchange for peace and protection from other raids. This step changed everything. England, for the first time in centuries, became an arena for diplomacy between Vikings and Anglo-Saxons. And although swords had not yet been sheathed, for the first time a word emerged that had previously been unknown in either the north or on the island: loyalty. It sounded softly, but its echo would determine the fate of the entire country. Meanwhile, Thorkel himself, standing on the wall of London and gazing at the Thames, said to his close associates, "The river that brought us here will now divide us." He knew that ahead was not just peace, but a trial that would decide who would remain in history and who would dissolve in the water, like the wake of a drakkar. The wind from the Thames once again brought the smell of smoke, but now it was the smoke of forges, not fires. London, under the rule of Canute and Thorkel, was transforming from ashes into the capital of a new era. The Vikings no longer looked like conquerors. They became part of the city. Their ships stood at the docks, converted into warehouses. Their warriors traded furs and amber in the same streets where blood had recently flowed. But beneath this seeming harmony, tension brewed, tension between those who came and those who remained. Fact: after conquering London, Canute the Great began a large-scale reorganization of England. He divided the country into 4 large regions, earldoms, appointing Scandinavian jarls to them. Thorkel received East Anglia and control over the fleet. Chronicles note that for the first time since Roman times, the Anglo-Saxons saw centralized governance, and a regular army based on naval power. This system was called ledang, a naval levy, under which every freeman was obliged to build or supply a ship. The Vikings transformed it into an instrument of power. Now the sea became not a road for plunder, but a road for law. However, Thorkel himself gradually withdrew from affairs. He was a whole generation older than Canute, had seen too many battles. According to various sources, he was increasingly seen in monasteries, where he spoke with priests about sin and forgiveness. For a man who had lived a life amidst storms and steel, this seemed strange. But perhaps he was the first to understand that a sword can conquer land, but not souls. Meanwhile, Edmund Ironside did not give up. After Ethelred's death, he became king and gathered forces for a final battle. His army clashed with Canute's forces at Assendon. According to chronicles, the battle lasted a whole day. The ground trembled from the blows of spears. The air was thick with dust and blood. Edmund fought at the forefront, in a red cloak, his sword ringing like a bell. But in the evening, as the sun set, the Anglo-Saxons began to retreat. Victory remained with Canute. Historians differ on whether Thorkel participated in this battle. Some write that he watched from afar, like an old sailor gazing at a storm in which he no longer belonged. Perhaps it was then that he realized the era of his generation had ended. After the defeat, Edmund and Canute made peace. London remained with Canute and the western lands with Edmund. But soon Edmund died under mysterious circumstances. Thus, all of England came under the rule of the Danish king. Archaeological finds confirm that in these years London experienced an unusual flourishing. In the 11th century layers, a huge number of Scandinavian artifacts have been found. Amulets in the shape of Thor's hammer, fragments of swords, jewelry with runes, but alongside them, crosses, Latin inscriptions, images of saints. These objects lie in the same layers, as if a symbol of how two cultures intertwined. Modern historians call this the Scandinavian synthesis, a moment when Northern fury and Christian steadfastness created a new type of society. From this blend, an England capable of facing future centuries was born. For ordinary people, life went on. Fishermen went to sea, merchants sold bread and beer, children played on the ruins of old towers, unaware that beneath their feet lay the blood of 3 generations. But the time of the Vikings was passing. They were no longer strangers. Their children spoke English, were baptized, and served in the royal guard. Thorkel the Tall died, as they say, in the silence of a monastic cell, not on the battlefield, not to the cries of enemies, but to the ringing of a bell that he himself had once ordered to be hung on a tower erected on the site of the destroyed bridge. Historians do not know exactly where he is buried, but legends say that beneath his grave lies an iron helmet reflecting the light of the water, the light of the Thames, his last road. Thorkel's death became a symbol of the end of an era. The world born in fire and blood now rested on laws and faith. And yet, memory did not vanish. It lived in songs, in ancient inscriptions, in the rhythm of the oar that sailors heard as they went up the river. It was this rhythm that would one day awaken an ancient call again, a call that forever binds man to the sea and the sword to honor. The sound of the Thames grew softer, but the memory of the Drukars did not dissolve in the water. Several decades passed, and a new generation of Englishmen told their children stories of those who came from the north. They no longer called them barbarians. The word Viking gradually came to mean not a plunderer, but a seafarer, a pioneer, a person capable of defying fate itself. And yet, every time the fog rose over the river, it seemed that the carved prow of a dragon would soon emerge from it. Fact. It was precisely after the conquest of London and the arrival of Canute the Great that the merging of the Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon worlds began. In the administrative documents of those years, double names appeared, Godwin Ulf, Edric Canute, which reflected not just a mix of cultures, but the birth of a new elite. England for the first time became a kingdom open to the sea, rather than closed behind walls. This became the foundation of its future maritime power. The word that became a symbol of this era was fleet. Not just a collection of ships, but a living organism in which every warrior was part of a common force. This concept would later transition into the English word fleet, and the echo of Viking order would resonate in every naval charter for the next 1,000 years. Archaeological findings confirm Northern influence became an integral part of daily life. In the 11th century layers in London, jewelry with ornaments typical of Scandinavia but featuring Christian symbols has been found. One amulet depicts a cross entwined with a dragon, a fusion of two faiths, two worlds, two codes. Modern historians write that London became the melting pot of Europe long before that phrase came into existence. Here, the blood of warriors, the language of merchants, the faith of monks, and the ambitions of rulers mingled. From this alloy, tempered by the fire of war, grew a country that would later conquer the seas and create an empire. But at its origins stood not kings, but those very sea wolves who once rode against the current of the Thames. However, the end of this story was not a triumph, but a quiet revelation. Songs about the bridge's destruction survived centuries, becoming the children's rhyme, "London Bridge is falling down." People sang it, unaware that behind the simple words lay the memory of that night when the river swallowed the bridge, and with it, the old order. In this strange intertwining of horror and play lies history's main paradox. Humanity remembers its fears, even when it ceases to understand their meaning. When archaeologists extracted fragments of ancient piles from the Thames silt, they discovered traces of charred wood and remnants of metal rings, perhaps those very ones to which the Vikings attached the ropes that destroyed the bridge. These finds became silent witnesses to the force that changed the course of European history without a single word, only the sound of an oar. But the memory of Thorkel and his fleet is not just a chronicle of destruction. It is a reminder of the price every nation pays for fear and for hope. When Athelred chose silver instead of resistance, he saved lives, but lost faith. When Thorkel chose peace instead of glory, he found tranquility, but vanished from legends. History rarely spares those who make choices, but it is precisely from these choices that it is made. Today, looking at the gray waters of the Thames, one can imagine how life once teemed here. The strokes of oars, the crackle of torches, the clang of swords. But if one listens more closely, another sound is heard, the measured breathing of a city that inherited the strength of those who knew how to wait, to bide their time, and to act at the right moment. London did not fall forever. It rose again, as great cities do, but the scar left by the Vikings remained in its memory. In every old street leading to the river, an invisible connection is felt with those who came from the fog, and everyone who crosses the bridge today walks over the place where the fate of Europe was once decided. And perhaps the main question to ask ourselves is not about Thorkel, not about Canute, but about us. If you were in his place, at the helm of a drakkar, in icy water, before the walls of an impregnable city, would you row against the current? Or would you let the river carry you downstream, to peace, to oblivion? The story of London and 350 drakkars is not just a tale of war. It is a mirror in which everyone can see their own reflection. Because in every era, in every person, lives their own Viking, one who chooses to go with the flow or to fight against it.